15 years after the divorce, he sees his ex-wife with 4 sons when he found out. Kwame squinted against the late afternoon sun, its golden rays filtering through the budding acacia trees of the park. He sat stiffly on a weathered wooden bench, a newspaper crinkling under his tightening grip. Yet he wasn't really reading, hadn't glanced at the headlines proclaiming distant political drama. His gaze was elsewhere, darting through the swirl of visitors, joggers in bright kiting-patterned leggings, elderly couples shuffling along gravel paths, children chasing weaver birds. Then she appeared, a familiar silhouette emerging from the colorful crowd, cutting through the chaos like a memory made flesh, a Bani. 15 years had passed, 15 long and hollow, and yet he would recognize her anywhere. The same gentle curve of her face, the same graceful stride that glided instead of stepped, the same quiet kindness shining in her deep brown eyes. She wore a light blue coat, unbuttoned despite the early Harmattan chill, and her thick, dark braids were in a loose bun, strands dancing free in the breeze. She looked almost unchanged, but there was something new, a subtle confidence, a strength that hadn't been there when they'd shared a life together. And there were children trailing her, 3 boys, 2 older ones, perhaps 14, all lanky, with tousled dark curls. Their voices rose in a playful argument over a football. The youngest, no more than 5, clung to her hand with chubby fingers, wide eyes marveling at the world. Kwame froze, breath catching sharply, ice filling his lungs. A Bani with children. His mind reeled. Could these be her sister's kids, or a friend's? But the tenderness in her glance said otherwise. The tilt of her head, the gentle laugh she gave as the older boys jostled each other. That was a mother's gaze, unmistakable. Memories rose like a crashing tide. Their marriage, first filled with hope, then overshadowed by sterile clinics, specialists with clipped voices delivering that verdict: infertility. Unexplained, irreversible. He still felt the crushing despair that turned him inward. He remembered Abeni's tears, her soft sobs on the couch, the final haze when the divorce papers were signed, neither of them believing they could survive, of the void where their dreams had died. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice, snapping him back. A teenage girl gestured at his newspaper. He blinked, disoriented, then handed it over with a mumbled, "Yeah, sure." She hurried off, leaving him with the chaos of his thoughts. Tugging a hand through his graying hair, he forced himself to breathe, trying to quell the panic spiraling inside him. Perhaps he was jumping to conclusions, maybe those boys weren't hers, but the resemblance struck him. The older ones had her high cheekbones and steady gaze. The little one wore her crooked, endearing smile. He stood abruptly, knees stiff after too long on the bench. The sun was dipping lower, painting the sky in pink and orange, casting long shadows. Abeni and the boys were heading to the playground, by the pond. He could hear their laughter, one of the older boys shouting, "Bet I can swing higher than you," while the youngest tugged her coat. "Mama, push me, Mama." The word "Mama" punched the air from Kwame's lungs. He staggered, gripping the bench for support. It was true, she had children. He watched her kneel by the swing set, lifting the youngest boy gently. He heard her voice, faint but clear. "Hold on tight, Sefu," she said, giving the swing a push. The older boys scrambled onto higher swings, daring each other with reckless energy. Kwame's throat tightened. He should walk away, drive to his empty apartment, let this slip into the past, but he couldn't. He needed to know. Who was the father? When had this happened? "Hey, Kwame," came a voice from the next bench. "Mr." Bakari, a regular, studied him with concern. "You okay?" Kwame forced a tight smile. "Just lost in thought." The old man nodded at Abeni and the boys. "Someone you know?" Kwame hesitated, then shook his head. "Not anymore." The sun sank below the horizon, and the park lights flickered on. Abeni gathered the boys, brushing dirt off the youngest's knees while the older 2 squabbled over who'd swung higher. She looked happy, whole. Regret, envy, and longing twisted in Kwame's chest, reminding him that he was alone. For years, he'd thrown himself into work, chasing promotions, corner offices, money, all of it meaningless as he realized now, watching Abeni with her sons. Memories washed over him again, sucking him under. Those days when his love for Abeni had been a fire that consumed all else. back when they'd met at an art and architecture exhibition in Lagos, young and ambitious. She was a doctor, brimming, with ideas. He was an aspiring architect, obsessed with reshaping skylines. They clicked in an instant, connected by a hunger to create something lasting. Their courtship was a whirlwind of late-night talks, city walks, and sketches of dream homes. Within a year, they married in a small ceremony at the magistrate's office, she in a simple white dress, he in a borrowed suit. They took a third-floor walk-up with tall windows overlooking a jacaranda-lined courtyard. Nights on the sagging couch, her legs over his, planning their future and children, imagining laughter and small footprints smudging the table. But months turned to years, and no pregnancy test showed 2 lines. Visits to specialists, blood work, ultrasounds. Hope gave way to despair, faith to hollow sadness. He remembered how she cried at night, and how he'd lie there, promising it would be okay, despite not believing it himself. Then Abeni brought up IVF, a last straw of hope. They seized it, though each negative result was a deeper wound. By the 3rd failed cycle, they barely spoke. Another loss came on a rainy afternoon. Abeni sat at the kitchen table, red-eyed, her hands trembling around a chipped mug. She said softly, "I can't do this anymore, Kwame. I can't keep torturing us." He was exhausted too. The guilt gnawed at him every time she flinched from an injection, but he couldn't let go of fatherhood. He wanted children too desperately. One evening, staring at rain-streaked windows, he admitted, "I can't live without children, Abeni. I want to be a father. I don't know how to let it go." She was silent, watching him with tearful understanding. "Okay," she said at last. No anger, just resignation. Divorce loomed, a slow tide they couldn't outrun. He pushed for it, feeling it was the only path to the fatherhood he dreamed of. He didn't blame her. This wasn't her fault any more than his. They parted, quietly, once fiercely in love but now facing a mountain they couldn't climb together. The day he left their apartment, she stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. "Take care of yourself, Kwame," she said, voice subdued. He nodded, unable to look her in the eye as he drove away. Afterward, Kwame buried himself in work. Architecture became his refuge, a way to smother the emptiness echoing through his nights. He designed sprawling housing developments, shopping centers, and office buildings that scraped the skyline. His hands hovered over drafting tables from dawn to dusk, letting the smell of graphite soothe him. Awards piled up, and he moved to a sleek downtown apartment overlooking the river. But it was all cold and hollow, with no warmth or laughter. He tried dating, smart, beautiful women, a lawyer who loved jazz, a painter who left bright smears on his shirts, but none of them had Abeni's quiet, steady strength. He realized too late that leaving her hadn't healed anything. He had given up the person he truly loved. His memories snapped off, and he was back in the park's chill, Abeni and her boys gone. He stood there, paralyzed by questions. How had she built a life he'd believed they couldn't have? He needed answers. He started with people who still knew pieces of her story. Nia, a colleague of Abeni's, answered the phone warmly. They chatted, then Kwame gently steered the conversation toward Abeni. "She's doing great," Nia said. "Works hard, raises her kids alone. That woman never complains." Alone? Kwame clutched his glass of whiskey, mind spinning. She had kids but no husband, no partner. Next he dialed Kofi, an old family friend. Kofi's booming voice reached through the line. They exchanged pleasantries. Then Kwame nudged the topic toward Abeni's children. A heavy silence. Finally, Kofi said, "Abeni has raised 3 boys on her own. She's tough, does everything herself." Confusion welled up in Kwame. "We couldn't have children," he muttered. "Life's complicated," Kofi replied. "Let's just say there was no adoption. All 3 are Okafors." Kwame felt the air punched from his lungs as he dropped into a chair. Abeni, raising 3. Children alone, all with her last name, from a situation that defied everything they'd believed was possible. He needed to see her, to ask her directly. His best friend Jide agreed to meet him at a small cafe. They settled into a corner booth, and Kwame got right to it. blurting that he'd seen a Benny with 3 children. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted. Jide sighed, studying him. "I always thought divorcing her was a mistake. She really loved you. Are you happy now?" Kwame couldn't answer. Jide leaned back. "Look, I don't know all the details, but she's been through more than you can imagine. Maybe let her be." "I can't," Kwame whispered. "I have to know if they're mine." Jide's stare hardened. "A right? You walked away, chased fatherhood without her. You had your chance, you missed it." Kwame slumped. "I still need to know." Jide sighed again. "All right, but the truth might break you all over again." Kwame paced his apartment for hours before finally calling Abeni. He still remembered. Her number. His heart hammered as the line rang. Then her voice came, soft but guarded. "Hello?" He nearly dropped the phone. "Abeni, it's Kwame. We need to talk." Silence crackled across the line until she said, "All right," and they arranged to meet in 2 days at a cafe on the city's outskirts. He arrived 20 minutes early, nerves shredding him. The cafe was simple, with faded shutters, and the air smelled of coffee and burnt sugar. He chose a table near the window, sipping coffee but tasting nothing. Then the door chimed, and she stepped in. Time had etched faint lines around her eyes, and a trace of weariness hovered in her posture, but determination burned in her gaze. She sat across from him, folded her hands, and waited, silent. Kwame cleared his throat, voice hoarse. "Thank you for coming," he said. I wanted to talk about the children." Her eyes flickered with deep sadness. "I knew you'd ask." She fell silent, inviting him to continue. He swallowed. "I need to know how you had kids. We tried for so long." Her jaw tightened as she stared out the window. "It's none of your business, Kwame." The restraint he'd mustered snapped. "After everything we endured, I have a right." She turned back, eyes flashing. "A right? You gave up that right when you left, when you decided children mattered more than me. Don't barge in and demand answers." She was right. He slumped back, words dying. Yet the gnawing questions wouldn't vanish. "Please, Abeni," he whispered, voice stripped of pride. She exhaled, shoulders tensing. When her gaze returned, there was pain, a new resilience. "After the divorce, I couldn't give up. I knew we had frozen embryos at the clinic." Kwame froze, remembering forms they'd signed in a final attempt. He'd assumed it ended with their marriage. "I kept trying," she said. "For myself. The first attempts failed. I almost gave up. But then a miracle happened. I got pregnant with twins." His heart pounded. Twins. The older boys he'd seen. They were his, born from the embers of the dream he'd abandoned. "It was so hard," she continued quietly. "No partner, no support, sleepless nights, hospital bills, fear I wasn't enough, but I managed. Jabari and Kato are my life." He nodded numbly, mind spinning. Then he remembered the youngest, a boy of 5. "And the little one?" Abeni's face changed, shadowed. "That's another story, Kwame," she said guardedly. "One night at the maternity hospital, a newborn was left. No name, just abandoned. I was on shift. I couldn't let him be lost in the system, so I became his guardian, then legally adopted him. He's Seifu." Kwame's world tilted. Abeni, the woman he'd known so intimately, had undone the verdict of infertility on her own, then adopted a boy, weaving him seamlessly into her family. He asked if Seifu knew she wasn't his biological mother. "Yes," she replied, a note of pride. "All 3 know his story. We love him just the same." Kwame sat in stunned silence. Twins from their embryos, plus a 3rd child she'd rescued. And he'd missed it all. He'd turned away from a future that might have been theirs. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, voice tight with resentment and hurt. She looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Because you left. I didn't want to drag you back, risking another abandonment. I was afraid you'd hurt me again." He tried to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Could he really claim otherwise? Her expression softened. "I don't blame you now. I stopped a long time ago. But I can't change the past. Not for you or for me." He stared at her, desperation flickering. Then what am I supposed to do? She studied him intently. Time will tell, Kwame. Time will show if you're different. She rose, pulling her coat close, and walked out. He watched her vanish, the bell over the door chiming. Relief didn't come. Instead, regret dragged at him like a millstone. He paid in a daze, drifting into the drizzle outside. The future lay open, an uncharted blueprint. He decided to start small. Abeni had mentioned offhand that Jabari had a big football match the next day. Kwame seized on that detail, arriving early at the field, joining the sea of parents and their thermoses. He spotted Jabari easily, tall, determined, with Abeni's high cheekbones. At the whistle, the game erupted. Jabari scored twice, sending the parents into rapturous cheers. Pride swelled in Kwame unbidden. After the whistle, Kwame hovered near the sidelines, watching Jabari celebrate. Mustering courage, he approached. "Hi," he said, voice trembling. "You played great out there." Jabari wiped sweat off his brow, squinting warily. "Thanks. I'm a friend of your mum's," Kwame added, awkward. "Oh," Jabari said, nodding, shifting away. Clearly uneasy, he jogged to join his teammates. Kwame turned back to his car, feeling as though he'd barely made any impact. But it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Kwame inched closer to their lives, with Abeni's guarded permission. He arrived at her modest house, a two-story with peeling paint, its yard scattered with bicycles, bearing small gifts, roasted plantains for dinner, new-colored pencils for homework. He helped the twins with math at the kitchen table, fumbling through explanations while marveling at their sharp minds. He played with Sefu, racing toy cars across the living room rug, the boys' delighted giggles brightening the space. Sometimes he invited them to a matinee. He kept his role simple, a friendly helper. He never called himself father. Not yet. The twins warmed to him gradually. Jabari started asking about buildings, how skyscrapers stayed up, why they didn't topple. Kato, the shyer of the two, offered tentative smiles over shared jokes. Seifu, only 5, accepted him more, wholeheartedly, thrusting picture books at him at bedtime, calling Kwame with boundless enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Abeni watched from a distance, lingering in doorways with arms crossed, her face a mixture of cautious hope and memories that still hurt. One evening, after they'd finished a yam stew dinner, Kwame was shrugging into his jacket at the door when Abeni stopped him. The house was hushed, the boys were upstairs. She glanced at him, her features soft. "Thank you," she said, voice low. "For what you're doing for them." She stepped forward, hesitating, only a moment before brushing her lips to his cheek, a whisper of contact that sent heat through his chest. Her eyes shone with feelings she didn't voice. Then she pulled back and turned away. He stepped outside into the cool night, heart thrumming. Still, an unspoken gulf separated him from the twins. They let him in as Uncle Kwame, a bringer of roasted maize and awkward jokes. But father, no one dared say it. He watched them laugh and argue, their voices warming Abeni's house the way he'd once imagined his own children would. But he always left, stepping out into the night with an ache that wouldn't leave. Then, one crisp afternoon, golden leaves drifting across the yard, Kwame sat with Jabari on the porch steps, idly tossing a football back and forth. The boy seemed quieter, pensive, as though wrestling with questions. Without warning, Jabari fixed him with a steady gaze. "Uncle Kwame, did you ever want to have kids?" The question landed like a thunderclap. Kwame nearly dropped the ball. His breath caught, mind spinning. This boy was his son, but he didn't know it. Or did he suspect? Kwame struggled to steady his voice. "Yes," he answered, raw honesty, betraying his composure. "I always dreamed of having children. It was the biggest dream I ever had." Jabari tilted his head, curiosity mingling with doubt. "Then why don't you have any?" The words hung, the air thickening. Kwame stared at the ball in his hands, heart pounding. Could he say the truth now? That he did have children, Jabari and Kato, but he'd walked away before he knew. "It's a long story," he whispered. "Maybe someday I'll tell you." Jabari studied him for a moment, unreadable, then nodded, kicking at a fallen leaf. He let the subject drop, but a shadow remained in his eyes. Driving home under a fiery sunset, Kwame's thoughts churned. He couldn't keep hiding this. Jabari and Kato deserved to know who he was. That evening, Kwame called Abeni. He spoke with quiet determination in her small kitchen, the faint scent of ginger tea lingering. She leaned against the counter, arms folded defensively. "They're old enough," he said gently, "to hear the truth. About how I met you, how we tried so long for a family, how I walked away. I need to tell them I'm their father. They deserve that." Abeni's eyes flickered. She let out a soft sigh. "It's risky. They're finally starting to trust you. This could push them away, or maybe bring them closer." He nodded, jaw set. "I have to be ready for either." After a quiet beat, she gave a reluctant nod. "Tomorrow, then. I'll be there, but you'll do the talking." The next day, Kwame gathered the twins in the living room, a cramped space with a faded couch and cluttered coffee table. Jabari and Kato sat side by side, wariness in their posture. Abeni lingered by the doorway, arms crossed protectively. Seifu, too young to grasp the gravity, played upstairs. Kwame took a moment to compose himself, then spoke. "I need to tell you both something important," he began, voice shaking. "About me, your mom and you." He inhaled deeply, then dove in. How he and Abeni had met at an architectural exhibition, fallen in love, married with dreams of a family. How doctors told them they had unexplained infertility. How each negative result chipped away at their hope. "I wanted kids so badly," he said, eyes lowered. "When we couldn't have them, I felt like part of me was dying. I thought leaving was my only chance to become a father. It was the worst mistake of my life." His throat tightened. He forced himself to look up, meeting their eyes. "I didn't know she kept trying with our embryos. I only just found out that you, Jabari and Kato, are my sons. I'm your biological father. I haven't been in your life, and for that, I'm so sorry." Silence descended, thick and tense. Jabari's mouth hung open. Kato blinked rapidly. Shock and confusion etched into his features. Finally, Jabari managed, "So, you're our dad?" Kwame nodded. "Yes, I am." Kato's eyes shifted between Kwame and Abeni. "Why didn't we know before?" he asked, voice quavering. Abeni spoke gently from the doorway. "Because I thought it would hurt you, hurt all of us. I wasn't sure how he would handle it." They exchanged a loaded look, the twins grappling with new truths. Jabari swallowed. I don't know what to say," he said, voice shaking. "Are we supposed to call you Dad?" Kwame's heart clenched. "You can call me whatever feels right. I don't expect anything. I just want you to know I'm here if you want me to be." The twins exchanged another glance, the silent communication of siblings. Kato took a breath. "Can we think about it?" Kwame's lips twitched in a wobbly half-smile. "So of course, take all the time you need." The boys stood, numb, and drifted upstairs. Kwame sank onto the couch, pressing trembling hands together. He'd laid it all bare, and they could reject him. The days that followed stretched like a desert. He didn't visit, giving them room to process. He lay awake at night, replaying the moment he'd said, "I'm your father." Relief tangled with dread. Would they let him be part of their lives, or would they shut him out? Then one evening, Abeni appeared at Kwame's door wearing a thin coat dusted with twilight. His pulse pounded. She invited him back to the house. "They want to talk to you," she said, her tone measured but laced with apprehension. Arriving, Kwame stepped inside, heart hammering. Jabari and Kato waited in the living room, perched on the couch as before, but something in their posture had changed. They weren't hunched with anxiety. They looked resolute, if uncertain. Seifu was playing with blocks in another room, blissfully, unaware. Abeni lingered by the door, silent support. Kato spoke first, quietly. "We've talked about it a lot. We want to see where this goes." Jabari nodded, arms crossed in an echo of teenage bravado. "We don't know how this is supposed to work," he admitted, "but we're willing to, try. Get to know you." A wave of relief surged through Kwame. so powerful that tears prickled his eyes. He blinked them away, voice wobbling. "Thank you," he choked. "I can't tell you how much this means to me. I promise I won't let you down." They exchanged hesitant smiles. Kwame took a step closer, hands slightly extended. It felt like an unspoken invitation. Jabari and Cato glanced at each other, then stood. Slowly, they stepped forward into a shaky group hug. Kwame wrapped his arms around them, trying not to cry, feeling the solidity of them, his sons. He looked up and saw Abeni in the doorway, her deep brown eyes shimmering. A faint, tremulous smile tugged at her lips. He read gratitude there and caution, but also a spark of hope. She gave him the tiniest nod, as if to say, "I'm letting you try." In that moment he realized how much lay ahead. Months, years of learning to be the father he'd never been, healing the wounds he'd left. He couldn't erase the past, but maybe he could shape the future, taking the scattered pieces of their lives and building something new and whole. He tightened his hold on the boys, heart stuttering with a mixture of love, regret, and promise. He could hear Sefu's voice in the other room, excitedly babbling about a block tower. Soon, Kwame thought, I will meet that little one with the same openness, no half-secrets remaining. Finally, Abeni cleared her throat gently. The boys stepped back, rubbing at their eyes in embarrassment. Kwame gave a shaky laugh, wiping his cheeks. He nodded at them. "So," he said, voice thick, "maybe we can do something together tomorrow. A movie, or just a walk in the park?" They exchanged glances again, and Jabari shrugged, but he was smiling. "Sure," he said, "let's do it." A feeling like sunlight broke through Kwame's chest. Abeni smiled as well, a quiet, thoughtful smile. The world outside that small house felt momentarily washed away, leaving just them, this patchwork, family in the process of becoming something more. After that evening, Kwame became a fixture at the house bit by bit. He juggled his work schedule, turning down extra projects so he could see the boys more often. He brought books, grilled them on their homework, and cheered at Jabari's football games. He learned Cato was brilliant at tinkering, fascinated by how things worked. He knelt with him at the coffee table, taking apart old gadgets. Sefu became his boisterous sidekick, tugging his sleeve for piggyback rides. The earliest, deepest wounds still existed, but each day the tension faded another notch. The twins teased him, but it wasn't a stranger's tease now. It was the tentative banter of kids learning to trust a father they hadn't known, and Abeni. She watched all this with careful eyes. Sometimes she joined in, pointing out the best strategies for math problems or laughing at Kwame's frustrated attempts to fix a leaky faucet. Other times, she kept her distance, as though guarding her heart from potential hurt. But every so often, they shared a moment, a glance across the table, a silent memory of how they used to be. One late afternoon, after the boys had run off to the backyard, she turned to him in the living room, arms folded. "You've come a long way, Kwame," she said softly enough that her voice trembled. He swallowed, nodding. "I can't go back and fix what I did," he murmured, "but I'm trying. His eyes drifted to where the boys had raced outside. "I never stopped loving you. Any of you." Her eyes glistened. "I know," she whispered. There was no grand reconciliation, no sweeping kiss. Life had carved deep lines in both of them. She offered him a small, sad smile. Maybe that, he realized, was more precious than any grand gesture, an honest acknowledgement of who they were now. In time, Kwame found himself more at peace than he'd been in years. He still felt sharp pangs of regret at the lost decade, the birthdays he'd missed, the first steps he didn't see, the fatherly advice he never gave. But the present was bright and vivid. With an energy that healed some of those old aches, the twins gradually began calling him Dad. It happened spontaneously one afternoon, Cato handing him a wrench and muttering, "Here, Dad," without thinking. His cheeks colored when he realized what he'd said, but Kwame's chest tightened with a rush of joy so strong it hurt. Sefu, who hadn't lived through the old pain, embraced him with an easy innocence. One day the little boy asked gravely over breakfast, "Are you my dad too?" Kwame knelt by his chair, heart twisting. "I want to be," he said, voice catching. if it's okay with you. Seifu grinned, gap-toothed. Okay, Dad, he declared, and Kwame couldn't stop the tears that blurred his vision. At first, Abeni seemed torn by how to fit Kwame's role into their existing family. She'd borne the load alone for so long, forging a life with iron will and quiet perseverance. Allowing him back required trust, risk, but he sensed her softening day by day, as he proved he wasn't going to abandon them again. Sometimes, they shared dinner on the couch after the kids were asleep, talking about old times, the nights they'd stayed up designing imaginary dream homes, the hopes they once nurtured. It was delicate, both painful and sweet, as though they were picking up threads of a tapestry that had unraveled years ago. Nothing was perfect or easy, but a warm rhythm took hold. Kwame clung to the ordinary moments, helping Jabari with a tricky geometry proof, reviewing Kato's science project, chasing Seifu around the yard. He listened to Abeni recount stressful days at the hospital, sometimes offering to drive her there if she was too exhausted. They teased him about his serious manner, about how he still forgot to buy groceries before coming over. Yet, in their teasing, was acceptance. He was no longer an intruder, but a part of them. After a few months, Kwame and Abeni sat quietly one evening while the three boys slept. The house was finally calm, just a soft yellow lamp lighting the living room. Abeni looked at him across the old coffee table that had seen so many of their dreams and heartbreaks. "This is starting to feel real, you know," she said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "Like, we're a family." She paused, eyes flicking to the stairway. A strange, messy, patchwork family. But a family. Kwame exhaled slowly, feeling tears threaten. "It is real," he said. "It's as real as I can make it, Abeni." She reached across the table, her warm fingers tangling with his. "We have a long road," she murmured. "A lot of history to sort out," he nodded, heart thudding. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, voice unwavering. "Not again." She squeezed his hand, and he saw the flicker of relief in her eyes. They sat like that, hands linked. Two people who had circled the same dreams and sorrows, coming back to each other after a long time lost. The next morning, he woke up on the living room couch. He dozed off watching a late movie with Abeni. A blanket lay over him, carefully placed, and the house was stirring with the boys' voices. Through the open doorway, he saw Jabari rummaging in the fridge, and Kato moping around looking for clean socks. Seifu burst into the living room in pajamas, hair rumpled, and squealed, "Dad!" Upon spotting Kwame, he launched himself onto the couch. Kwame laughed, sitting up, ruffling the boy's hair. At that moment, Abeni poked her head around the corner with a bemused expression, lips quirked in a slight smile. She hadn't scolded him for sleeping over. Instead, she seemed glad he was there, part of their morning chaos. Kwame felt his chest expand with gratitude for these everyday wonders, the small echoes of footsteps in the hall, the sound of spoons clinking in cereal bowls, the swirl of life. That pulsed around him. Once he had believed fatherhood impossible, believed that losing Abeni was unavoidable. Yet here he was, living what had once been his most fragile dream, weaving himself into a family he'd never dared imagine he could reclaim. More time passed. Jabari scored the winning goal at a regional football match, and Kwame roared in celebration from the bleachers, tears of pride in his eyes. Kato, shyly, asked him to help build a small robot for a science fair, and they spent evenings hunched over circuit boards, Abeni's face brightening whenever she looked in on them. Seifu learned to ride a bicycle, shrieking for "Dad!" Each time he wobbled, the house hummed with arguments, laughter, spilled drinks, and unexpected hugs. Kwame cherished every messy second. Gradually, the longing for the past's do-over eased into acceptance. They couldn't recapture those missing years, but they could forge their present and future. One weekend, Abeni suggested they take a short road trip to the coast. Kwame nearly cried from joy at such a normal, family-like invitation. The boys piled into his car, fighting over the best seat while Abeni rolled her eyes affectionately. On the beach, the children raced across the sand, Seifu shrieking whenever the tide lapped his ankles. Abeni and Kwame walked together, the salt-tinged wind whipping their hair, shoulders brushing in a quiet intimacy. When the sun set, casting fire across the horizon, they snapped a photo. Abeni. In the center, Jabari and Kato on each side, Sefu perched on Kwame's shoulders, arms thrown wide. The camera captured a single instant in the swirl of their complicated lives, former husband and wife, once broken by loss, now sharing a wobbly but treasured sense of belonging. Later, back at home, Abeni rested her head on Kwame's shoulder as the kids slept. He slipped an arm around her and murmured, "I wish I hadn't left. We lost so much time." Her eyes closed briefly, a shadow of old hurt flickering across her face. "We did," she agreed softly, "but we have now. We have this." He pressed his lips to her hair, heart aching with both regret and a powerful gratitude. They had now. However flawed and belated, their second chance was real. Each day was another chance to prove he was worthy of it. Seasons changed. The small yard turned lush and green, then golden, then bare, cycles passing in the background of a family coming into its own. Abeni's medical career advanced. Kwame tackled new architectural projects, but never so many that he didn't have time for weekend football matches or parent-teacher conferences. He and Abeni found themselves cooking dinner together, brushing shoulders, exchanging a brief laugh at the chaos of three boys. Sometimes a nostalgic memory struck them of how they'd once dreamed of a life much like this, though neither had pictured the roads they would travel to get here. One afternoon, after picking up Sefu from a friend's birthday party, Kwame returned to find Abeni and the twins in the living room, rummaging through old photo albums. Images from the years he'd missed. She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "We were just telling them about when they were babies," she said. Jabari grinned awkwardly, pointing at a photo of himself and Kato in matching onesies. "We were tiny," he murmured. Kato added, "Mom was all alone, right?" Kwame felt a knife of guilt twist in his chest, but Abeni gently placed a hand on his arm. "Yes, I was," she said quietly. "But that doesn't matter anymore. You're here now." She guided his hand to the album. The twins didn't flinch. Instead, Jabari scooted aside, making room for him. With a shaky exhale, Kwame sat next to them, Sefu crawling into his lap, peering with wide-eyed fascination at photos of the older boys as infants. They laughed at hairstyles, teased Abeni about her old glasses, marveled at how serious the babies looked. Now and then, Kwame felt tears threaten when he saw just how much he'd missed, but the warmth of the present moment held him. The boys were pressed close against him, sharing their history with a father who'd come late. This, he realized, was healing. Eventually, Abeni closed the album. The children wandered off, leaving the two of them on the couch in a companionable silence. Abeni's gaze lingered on Kwame, a thousand unspoken things passing between them. Then she quietly said, "We made it through the worst, Kwame. We're still here." A tightness he'd carried for years loosened. He clasped her hand, bringing it to his lips. "We are," he echoed, voice trembling. Beyond the windows, twilight deepened, but the house was alive with the low murmur of the boys chatting and clattering. In the kitchen, the promise of tomorrow humming in every sound. Kwame felt the future unfolding like a blueprint he hadn't dared to sketch, one full of mistakes and do-overs, but also compassion and love. He could never recover the lost moments, but day by day, he was helping to build new ones that mattered. Abeni had shown him, through her own perseverance, that hope could flourish after despair, that families could form in the most unexpected ways. In the end, that was the truth they all clung to, the resilience of the heart, the power of love that survived betrayal, infertility, time, and absence. They hadn't planned this road, but it led them to a home where laughter, forgiveness, and second chances coexisted. And as the seasons turned again, Kwame knew that the family he'd always yearned for wasn't just a dream. It was here, laughing in the next room, ready to greet him each day with open arms.